Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, stories of directors falling out with crews on the sets of major Hollywood sequels, all that sort of thing, really. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're all films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is strictly a celebration of cinema and an appreciation that both films are really, really hard to make, and that I'm very glad that they do somehow get made. Without further ado then, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going to the 2000s for this one. Let's start here. I'll play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
HBO Films and Picture House present a Playtone picture.
Well, thanks for a memorable evening, Brian.
A new comedy.
You are completely ignorant.
Are you experiencing emotional problems?
About what we search for.
I dare you, go and see her right now and tell her how you feel.
I love you, Alice. At least I think I do.
What we long for.
I know you might not believe this. I was actually putting in a good word for you.
And who we're meant for.
People who really care about you don't mind if you make mistakes. It's what you do next that matters.
Starter for 10.
I didn't intend to. It was just a sort of animal attraction, sex thing.
This isn't necessarily helping me.
So that's a clip from the trailer from 2006's Starter for 10, directed by Tom Vaughan, written by David Nichols, based on his book, starring, well, lots of people who would go on to be really quite famous, and some who already were. James McAvoy, Alice Eve, Rebecca Hall, Dominic Cooper, James Corden, Catherine Tate, Charles Dance and Lindsay Duncan, they already have profile. Benedict Cumberbatch, what happened to him? Mark Gatiss, and Ben Wilbon's in there as well, who go on to be part of the Ghost Ensemble too. But at this stage, most of those people were much, much lower profile. And the story of Starter for 10 started with David Nichols. He was the novelist, it was his story, and he's a man, of course, who's gone on to have quite a writing career. And even by the time this story starts, really, he'd been working on screenplays for projects like Simpatico, he'd written for Cold Feet, and he had in his eyes a book that he wanted to write. He wanted to do this. He wanted to do this particular story as a book because he wanted a break from writing scripts, really. And it was the story of, effectively a first-person story of a young man who goes to university and finds himself on the hit TV show University Challenge. Now, if you're not in the UK, you might not have heard of University Challenge. It has been running since television. Well, it just feels like it's been running since the moment televisions came out of the ground. It's been running for decades here in the UK and is a relatively popular quiz show where teams of students from universities compete with each other to prove to us that they're much cleverer than us. And this, in a way, was part of the problem that they faced with it, because it proved quite hard to sell the idea of a film based around students at university, because in the eyes of the movie-going and television-watching public, they don't tend to elicit an awful lot of sympathy. Nonetheless, David Nichols pressed ahead with this story. He wrote it as a novel, first published in 2003, and just a little bit autobiographical as well. So then came the idea of, well, let's bring it to the screen, because there was an element of that in his head at one point fairly early on as well, but he'd not written this to be brought to the screen. Certainly the structure of the book didn't afford a particularly easy route forward for it, and so he wrote the novel as he wanted to pen it, but that got the attention of a production company over in the US. Now, the production company in question was Playtone. Playtone is the company run by Tom Hanks, set up in part so he could do his directorial debut, That Thing You Do, of which the record label in that is Playtone, which is where he gets his name. And so Tom Hanks took an option on Starter for 10 and then commissioned Nichols to adapt the book himself, to write the screenplay for it. It was a film that was going to come together, a very British romantic comedy really at heart, that was coming together unusually, almost entirely with American money, because Playtone did the developing, but HBO Films was responsible for putting the bulk of the money into it. A little bit later down the line, Sam Mendes' company, Neal Street Productions, came in to support it as well. They had some private equity money that was raised to get the film made, a little bit thrown in from BBC Films. But the bottom line, this modestly costed film was, well, it was finding a route forward to the screen. I mean, I don't have an exact budget figure for this one, but it was in the low single-digit millions to my understanding of it. So Nichols had worked in TV development for some time, and he'd had some success as well, and he understood why this didn't necessarily fit and why a bunch of British companies had passed on it. But also he knew how he'd come up with the idea, and almost his eureka moment really, because he had this idea watching the TV show University Challenge and speculating on the relationships between the teams. As a nerd myself, I can say this with full disclosure, it does tend to attract relatively nerdy people to that show, and it's just like, well, how do they get on once the cameras are switched off on this one? He also wanted to write about being at that point in his life, being 18, 19 years old. And he saw that if he could bring all these ideas together and put together a story that would bring in comedy, a bit of darker stuff, with a backbone of class, privilege, snobbery really from a variety of angles as well. And he also wanted to specifically set this and also the film in 1985. Now, lots of films and stories that are set in the 1980s lean into the extreme edges of the decade. But 1985 setting was particularly specific to Nichols and also to the man who'd go on to direct Starter for 10, a man called Tom Vaughan, because they reconciled. This was a period in the 1980s where it didn't have the decadence or the flamboyance of either the early or the late 1980s. If anything, it was a little bit of a grumpier time. And so he was very specific about this particular time frame in there. And this would in turn inform the subsequent look at the film that was going to be made. That they would dig out source material from that era, 1985. They would find the magazines, the movies, the music, the fashion, and they had to decide just how into the excesses that were still there that they wanted to lean. And so Nichols was cracking on with writing his story and writing his screenplay. And I mentioned Tom Vaughan just before, so let's focus on the director, because he too was coming up through television. He had been directing episodes of the TV show Cold Feet. If you're not familiar with Cold Feet, hugely successful drama here in the UK. At this point as well, Vaughan also had a variety of short films to his name that he'd written and directed, and he'd been involved in a film. He directed a film in particular called I Saw You, which also involved Nichols as well. And so he was busy. He was directing things. He'd done a couple of television movies. And also, crucially, he and Nichols went to university together. They were both at Bristol University. They'd known each other a long time. They talked to each other a lot, and they had a shorthand between each other because all the rough edges were knocked off by the amount of time that they'd known each other, really. And so they both felt some solidarity with the lead character as well, the character of Brian in the film. The idea of going from a small seaside town to a city university. They felt as confused as Brian, and they both kind of lent into the fact that there's an element of a personal story to this. As Vaughan would reconcile when he first took delivery of the screenplay, he just said, if I could write something, and he talks about this on the DVD extras, he said, this is what I'd want to write. And he knew that he could work with Nichols and there wouldn't be preciousness between the two of them. He knew between the two of them as well that they could lean into the political themes underpinning the era as well. Things like the miners' strike in the UK, nuclear disarmament, the Free Nelson Mandela campaign that was going on around the world, apartheid, and they wanted to reference those elements in the film that they were putting together. It's a masterclass of casting, this movie, if you've never had the pleasure, and it really is a pleasure. And James McAvoy is one of the many people who got a real break in this, taking on the lead role. And of course, I mean, in the interviews, it's quite hard to find much deep material on this. It's taken an awful lot of digging. But in the interviews for this one, I mean, the talk is James McAvoy was always the first choice, the obvious choice. And I can't really scratch much further than that on that, short of the fact that I want to give particular credit to the casting director on Starter for 10. Now, that person is Nina Gold, who's gone on to cast films like Attack the Block and The Power of the Dog and Star Wars Episode 9 as well. She's been casting Indiana Jones. I mean, her list of credits is just terrifying. But her eye for upcoming talent was just like, I mean, pretty much peerless at this stage. And so across the assorted auditions that took place for Starter 10, in came all of these names. I mean, Rebecca Hall, this was her first film role. Alice Eve, she was cast, and then at that point, then they had to find her parents. And I don't want to go deeply spoilery on what her parents have to do in this particular film, but short of to say that there's a degree of exposition involved. And so they needed people who would bring some gravitas to that, who would also be in on the fun of it. And Charles Dance and Lindsay Duncan duly signed up. But they had profile, and people who had less profile who were in the ensemble were people like Dominic Cooper and James Corden. And of course, Benedict Cumberbatch being the obvious one, who's gone on to global dominance and Oscar nominations and such like. And I will double down on my mention of Ben Wilbon, because I think the TV series Ghost is an absolute delight. And so this low budget film, this low budget cast came together. But Tom Vaughan, who by now had signed on to the dotted line to direct this film, well, he was battling a slightly different problem as he went through the pre-production of Starter for 10, because he and David Nichols both knew that this film had to have the music of the era threaded through it, and that he really wanted it to reflect the time, and that was not going to be particularly cheap in this instance. The particular challenge that they faced was a couple of sequences in the movie were written specifically to certain tracks. And so, again, I come back to the fact there wasn't a lot of money to spend on this, but they were pre-clearing bits of music that they really, really wanted to include in the film. And Vaughan admits in an interview he did with IndieWire, actually, he kept expecting pushback. He kept expecting people to say, you know, you can't do this. But instead, they kept going, and they were able to get the bulk of the tunes that were after. I'll come to this again when I talk of the post-production of this movie. Now, this being a relatively independent film, and also a film that was using money from America and shooting in Britain, there was a little bit of a financial scare on this when the exchange rate fluctuated quite dramatically just before the start of filming, which that simple change in the market suddenly left the budget of Starter for 10 looking a bit short. And as David Nichols told the BBC, it just meant that they were off rattling tins again. And on the one hand, they'd find one British company who would say it's not commercial enough. And then another would say, oh, no, we don't want this. It's too commercial. They couldn't quite understand why the reaction to it was so diverse. And it was a bit of private equity money that helped plug some of the gaps as well. Vaughan also in pre-production was doing a lot of work on the style of the film, and he argued that that he didn't want to make a knowing 1980s movie. He didn't want the costumes and the hair to overwhelm the characters. He wanted it a bit more true to life. He wanted to capture how students were dressing, in his eyes, in 1985. He wanted to capture the set dressing, and locations had to reflect that as well. And he told IndieWire, he said, we stripped away everything that was post-1985, so cars, street furniture, shop fronts, and what we were left with looked as it did in 1985, which is to say it had layers of every year that came before 85. He said it's a textured look, and his argument was very little of 1985 actually looked distinctly like 1985, and that's what they tried to capture for the movie. So, the book had been published in 2003, and here we are now at the start of production on Starter for 10 on September the 5th, 2005, and it was announced in Screen Daily that the funding was coming together through a series of sources. The report said that the film was going to be produced by Tom Hanks's Playtone in association with Sam Mendes' Neal Street Productions. So 2 big Oscar winners in there for a start, all for HBO Films. And it also confirmed the locations. It said the film is produced in association with the BBC. Shooting will continue in Greater London, Bristol and Clacton through the end of October. And that, chums, is the first mention of Clacton ever on this podcast, and here's hoping it's not the last. The budget, this is the only reference I can find to the budget anywhere, was described as being under $10 million for the film. So, I mean, my guess would be it's in the £3 to £4 million mark. But again, that's me just kind of throwing darts a little bit. And it was up against the boundaries and the parameters of low budget filmmaking as well. Because even though this is a film primarily set in Bristol, in and around Bristol University, Vaughan had to battle just to get a week of filming in Bristol itself. Most of the Bristol scenes aren't shot there. So he did manage to get on location, but they got in location at the end of summer, whereas the footage that he needed to capture was more winter-based. And he explained in an interview with the BBC that's why they couldn't get wider shots of Bristol into the final cut of the film. So he wanted to put, for instance, a local landmark, the Clifton Suspension Bridge, into the movie. But when they went to scout it and have a look, the area was just surrounded by green. It was very, very evidently summer. And they had to juggle where they were going to spend their resources. They could, in theory, have shot that and gone into post-production, done some effects work and made it look wintry. But the yin and yang of that was if they did it, they wouldn't be able to afford all the music they were looking to do. So instead, they weren't able to, they decided not to go with the wide shots that they'd originally planned. But he did still manage to get the production to Bristol just for a bit of shooting. That said, the scenes in and around Bristol University were actually shot at the University College in London, University College London instead. And for Nichols on this one, I mean, he described it really as quite eerie at times. I mean, he's a huge fan of classic comedy films like The Apartment and Annie Hall and Rushmore. He's a big fan of The Graduate as well. And he argued that comedy on the big screen often looks quite flat, that it's hard to find too many people who have directed a comedy and brought a particular visual style to it, hugely influenced by Billy Wilder. And that's kind of what he wanted this film to lean towards. But also, in much the same way as like someone like Safraz Manzoor on Blinded by the Light would go to the set of that film and see basically his life recreated, so Nichols went on to the shoot of Starter for 10 and went into the bedroom set for the character based on him, Brian Jackson, in 1985. And he just said, I don't know where they got some of the details from my photographs, but it was an absolute spitting image of my bedroom in 85. And they were really getting quite close to, I mean, as I said, it's a semi-autobiographical film anyway, but they were leaning very, very close to Nichols' life and his upbringing. I should also put one little bit in here as well, that Catherine Tate is one of the people in the cast who bizarrely ended up cast as the mother of James McAvoy in this one, despite the fact that the age difference between the pair of them was negligible. But this was a big screen outing for her as well. And the film wrapped up on the 1st of November 2005. So the shoot of it went for just under 2 months. And in post-production, which was relatively straightforward, Tom Vaughan nonetheless found himself revisiting the subject of music because they'd pre-cleared some of the music, so that bit was absolutely fine. But as they started editing, I mean, they just started laying onto the film tracks that they just felt would fit it. And they were putting things like The Cure and The Smiths. I mean, they weren't going for the cheap stuff on this. And again, Vaughan was sat there fully expecting to be told when it got close to the final cut that the production wouldn't be able to afford to clear those tracks. He'd have to go with lower budget stuff, things that are a bit more contained. But bizarrely, to his eyes, that call never really came. And what happened was when they sought pricing details for some of the high-profile tracks that they were looking for, there was an appreciation and an understanding that Starter for 10 was actually going to be a lower budget production, and the prices scaled down accordingly. They wanted to support this small British film, and that's why the soundtrack to this film really punches above the weight of the budget of it. There was a little bit of debate over whether Start of a 10 was a good title. I mean, again, this was being funded by American money, and the Start of a 10 would mean next to nothing in America, unless I apologise if I'm missing a massive subset of University Challenge fans in the States, and you know, all power to you. But the box office returns for Start of a 10 in the US suggest there aren't that many of you out there. And Alice Eve would reflect actually to the Daily Beast that it was a big debate, the title, and she would concede it just didn't travel, although she would describe the film itself as such a sweet movie and a great experience as well. It would debut in, the autumn of 2006 in the end, that it got a premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2006, that was, and then it got a broader UK release in November 2006 ahead of debuting in Canada and America in February 2007. The response to the film was really warm, though. And I mean, rom-coms were heavily in decline at this point too, but there was a lot of praise for the film itself, for the performances, and for what they managed to cram into a really delightful 92-minute movie as well. What that didn't reflect, though, was box office. That as much as Start of a 10 had gone down a treat, and it certainly found more of an audience since it was released, it was hardly burning the box office up. In fact, its global box office return in the end is $1.7 million in total. And so in the UK, I mean, which is where the vast bulk of that money came from, it barely I don't think it even scratched £1 million in total at the UK box office, in spite of the warm reception to it. Now, Tom Hanks was present during the promotion when the film went to the US, and in fact he got everyone over, and they had a premiere which Alice Eve would describe as the first time she'd been to Los Angeles, and off the back of this film it would help grease the wheels to her Hollywood career. And so when it opened in America on February the 23rd to the 25th was the weekend, 2007, you have to scroll right the way down the chart. It was playing on 20 screens, and it got it didn't get a great screen average, $1,800, and in 55th place it opened with $37,000. And I mean, I've talked about, like, sometimes the box office numbers historically on this podcast sound lower than they are, but I mean, we can't really buff that up particularly. That was low. The film was not crossing over, and in fact by week 2 it had gone down to 67th place in the chart, adding another $13,000. By the time Start of a 10 completed its US run, it had brought in $216,000 in total, and that was it. And so this was not a profitable film, at least certainly not on release, even with that soundtrack, with the likes of like the Buzzcocks, Motorhead, Echo and the Bunnymen, Tears for Fears, Style Council, Kate Bush. The soundtrack did all right from what I can ascertain, but Start of a 10 as a movie didn't. What happened over time, though, was it did gradually find more of an audience, and it still plays. I mean, it's on the BBC iPlayer service here in the UK at the time this is recording, and it's a delightful film. It's a really delightful film. Sometimes I use this podcast just to highlight a movie that might have passed you by, and particularly in an era where rom-coms are in short supply. This one's well worth digging out. But it's also a curio because of the number of careers it helped rocket fuel. And as Tom Hanks would reflect in an interview he gave to the Radio Times many, many years later, he said every British actor in it has since become a huge star. And he talked about, we had James McAvoy, Benedict Cumberbatch in his first or second movie, Rebecca Hall, it was definitely her first movie. He said, we even had that guy, James Corden, and he described it as a murderer's row of British up-and-comers. And he said, unfortunately, they hadn't quite upped and come because we didn't do much business, but there were scenes in that movie that were just, dare I say it, perfect. Hanks would stay in the David Nichols business. He would option a further one of his books, which I don't think in the end ultimately came to the screen. But Start of a 10 did, and this 2006 film is out there waiting for you to rediscover it. And if nothing else, you can look at the ensemble of this one and just think, what the hell happened to that lot? Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Story. So I'm just going to do just a couple of parish notices before we crack on with the second film I'm going to talk about in this episode. I've got 2 new issues of Film Stories assorted magazines now on sale. So Film Stories issue 38 leads with a huge interview with Daniel Radcliffe, where he talks to us about playing Weird Al Yankovic amongst many other things. And then I've got Film Junior magazine, which is aimed at under 15s. It's primarily written by under 15s as well. And that one leads with an interview with Alicia Weir, the star of Matilda, Roald Dahl's Matilda, the musical. Both of those magazines, were independent film magazines, are available now. They're mail order, so you need to go to store.filmstories.co.uk if you want to get copies of those. And thank you so much for any support you give them and for spreading the word of them as well. If you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways you can do that. If you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put a couple of pounds in the tin there, then you get the ad-free version of the podcast. You get the podcast early, pretty much every episode early. And you also find out the gossip of what's going on behind the scenes as well. So thank you to everybody who supports us there. If you can leave a review of this podcast, that costs you nothing, ideally a hugely positive one, that would be massively appreciated. Likewise, if you can subscribe to Film Stories at your podcast home of choice, that helps us enormously as well. We are independent. We don't have massive marketing budget. Well, we don't have marketing budgets. So we've got this far by word of mouth, really. And Film Stories has been going for just over 4 years now. And thank you so much to everyone who's helped push us to this point. But I'm going to stop with my parish notices because I'm going to get onto the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode. I'd imagine this is the one more of you come along to hear about. So why don't I shut up, play you a clip, and we're going to go into the story of this one right after this.
This operation is under military jurisdiction, and Hicks is next in chain of command. Am I right, Corporal?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Look, Ripley, this is a multi-million-dollar installation, okay? He can't make that kind of decision. He's just a grunt. No offense.
None taken. Pharaoh, do you copy?
Standing by.
Prep for dust-off. We're gonna need immediate evac.
Roger. On our way.
Say we take off. Nuke the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
There's not a clip from this film I could have picked that would have been a wrong one. That is just a snippet of dialogue from 1986's Aliens, written and directed by James Cameron, working from a story by David Giler, Walter Hill and James Cameron. Starring, a terrific ensemble again: Sigourney Weaver, Michael Biehn, Paul Reiser, Lance Henriksen, Carrie Henn, Bill Paxton, William Hope, Rico Ross, Al Matthews, amongst the assorted people in this one. And, of course, it is the sequel to a flat-out classic in its own right, 1979's Alien, directed by Ridley Scott. A real high watermark in horror cinema, really, and also a film that had been a gigantic success for the now struggling 20th Century Fox. And so it was in the early 1980s that Brandywine Productions, headed up by David Giler and Walter Hill, caught sight of a script that had been written by an upcoming filmmaker called James Cameron. The script was The Terminator, and so they liked this film. I should point out I'm leaning on a couple of books here, in particular Rebecca Keegan's excellent book about James Cameron that I hugely recommend. And she describes in there of how Giler and Hill read The Terminator, really liked it, and called him in about potentially working with them on another project. Because at this time, Giler and Hill had secured the remake rights to, of all films, Spartacus, and they wanted ideas for how they should approach it. They thought, this is a big commercial property, we can do something with this. And so Cameron came to that meeting armed with ideas for what he could do with Spartacus, and what he wanted to do was set it in space. And what Giler and Hill didn't want to do was set it in space. And so they weren't particularly impressed with really, the direction that he would want to take a Spartacus project. The only credit really got to his name at this point was Piranha 2, although The Terminator was upcoming. But it was Giler at the end of the meeting who just threw in the idea of, well, what about Alien 2? Do you think there's something in that? Well, James Cameron, like most people in the world at this point, was a huge fan of Alien, but 20th Century Fox was reticent about doing a follow-up for him. So it wasn't an instant thing in the early 1980s that if a film did well, a film got a sequel, although the 80s would really rocket fuel that era and kickstart franchise cinema as we know it, really. And so Fox hadn't intended to do a follow-up. And in fact, Fox was looking at the returns for horror films that had been coming through, and if anything, was slightly dissuaded from doing an Alien 2. It also tried to, as one story goes, press that the first Alien naturally made a loss, so it didn't owe Giler and Hill any money or anything, and so why would they make another one? This huge, gigantic box office hit was apparently a loss maker, and if you can sniff that from there, well, it could be sniffed at the time as well. So things there were settled in 1983 that Giler and Hill were then in a position that they could get a follow-up movie going, even if Fox was still reluctant really to press the button on a second film. So going back to that meeting, just as he's leaving the room, how about doing an Alien film? And Cameron was sideswiped, a gigantic fan of the first film. And he wasn't really aware that Giler and Hill were actually the producers of it, or that they were in the market for a second movie. And heck did Cameron want this. But still, he was playing cool. He was downplaying it a little bit. And so he was at that stage given a half-page outline of what Giler and Hill felt should be the starting point of the movie. And it would talk of a colony in space being wiped out and Marines being sent in to sort out whatever had gone on. And I mean, that part is entirely familiar, but that's all they had at that stage. So Cameron, a man as we're about to see was in a lot of demand at this stage, would take that away and come up with an outline for where he felt it should go. Now, this in turn brought in ideas from 1 or 2 other stories that had been writing at the time as well. And so he sent in his outline. Fox still wasn't sold at this stage. And in fact, there was a story doing the rounds that it was around 1983, 1984 that he even considered selling the sequel rights to another company altogether. He just didn't see a commercial return in this. Fox was heading up for sale as well, and Rupert Murdoch would pick the Fox Studios up in 1985, and so it was a real time of flux and change at the studio, which many felt was past its best days. So it didn't sell the sequel rights, but even so, just trying to get Fox to do Alien 2, it still was no easy thing. And for Cameron as well, there were other projects he was juggling. I just mentioned that before. So he'd written The Terminator and was going to direct The Terminator. He'd cast a man called Arnold Schwarzenegger in it and was keen to press ahead with that. He was also offered the job of writing a sequel to Rambo. The first Rambo film, which is called First Blood, was a hit for Sylvester Stallone. Stallone wanted a follow-up, and so there was an inquiry, would Cameron like to write Rambo Part 2? He was also at the time offered Alien 2. He was also trying to do The Terminator. And in fact, he went to Giler and Hill and they just said, well, just take the jobs. Just take them. And he was young at this stage. I mean, at the point he was doing it, it was late 20s, just turning 30. Also, filming on The Terminator was delayed because Arnold Schwarzenegger needed to make a sequel to Conan the Barbarian. That sequel would be Conan the Destroyer. So there was a little bit of time, and across a 3-month period, really, he went off to start writing all 3 scripts, and he would split his time pretty religiously on this. And so he worked out how many hours he had in a day and how much he needed to write, how many pages he needed to write of each. And in the end, before he went off to make The Terminator, he managed to put together the first 2 acts of what would be Alien 2, presented it to Fox. It was about 90 pages at this stage, so there was still work to do on it, and handed it in. And it was a man called Larry Gordon, whose name comes up a few times on this podcast, by now was president of Fox, and he read this and he was a bit, should we get someone else in to finish it and just get this thing done? And Cameron, in an interview that's in one of Robert Emery's director's books, credits Walter Hill as the person who sat there and really fought for him and said, no, you've got to wait for James Cameron to finish this. And I mean, Cameron retrospectively would muse, if he'd actually got the script written quicker, then he wouldn't have had the opportunity to direct the film because the script would have been in place. He would have been off doing The Terminator. And the deal that he'd struck with Giler and Hill was if he wrote the screenplay for it, he would at the very least have a shot at directing the film himself. He wasn't naive. He knew that would hinge on how well the Terminator came out. But still, it was the Terminator that got him in the room in the first place. So who knows? It was worth the pun. Let's fast forward a little bit then, because of course by the end of 1984 the Terminator had proven to be a huge hit. It was released in the US on October the 26th, 1984. A budget of $6.5 million would go on to make $80 million at the US box office, a #1 hit, and utterly put James Cameron on the map. No longer would they have to put on his posters from the director of Piranha 2. Now he had Terminator to his name, which would go on to be a massive video hit as well, and he had Hollywood Studios queuing up wanting to work with him. So this was an opportunity. I mean, he had a pick of projects at this stage. He delivered his Rambo script as well, and he had to decide what to do next. And when people were advising him on this, it's just like, well, just stay clear of Alien 2. You are absolutely on a hiding to nothing there, because even if it goes well, Ridley Scott's going to get the credit for setting up the alien world. More likely, it's a sequel. It's going to be worse than the original, and you'll just get hammered for it. But this was Cameron now, turning 30, and with a bedrock of confidence to this. I mean, he didn't think of his career in that way. Would this be a ridiculous career move to make? He just knew he really loved the idea and he really wanted to do the film, to the point where he'd started calling the film Aliens now, and he, influenced by things like The Dirty Dozen, the whole idea of a war movie in space, the idea of the character of Ellen Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver, of course, as a sort of John Wayne style figure in there. And of course, he'd researched war movies and war history a lot when he was writing the screenplay to Rambo First Blood Part 2. And so he just went back to Alien, and they'd waited for him. I mean, an incredible thing that, really, when you consider that he didn't have a hit movie to his name at that point. They were willing to wait for an Alien 2. And to a degree, that shows how low down the radar Alien 2 was at 20th Century Fox. And so he started just finishing his script off, but also he was consciously aware of a problem approaching. Because he'd written a screenplay he'd written it around the character of Ellen Ripley, and he'd fleshed the character out a lot. But the problem was, no one had told Sigourney Weaver, who played Ellen Ripley, of course, that there was a sequel on the way, that this was news to her. I mean, we certainly weren't in the era where people would sign a 3-picture deal and thus would be compelled to return for the sequel, that they'd be contractually obliged to do so. She didn't have a contract. She didn't know the project was really happening. And so in the end, it was Cameron who decided to bite the bullet and just give her a call and explain what he was up to. And she was a little bit suspicious at first, goes the story, but then when Cameron fleshed out what he was looking to do with the character in the film, she was interested and agreed to read the screenplay, and the pair would meet up, and Weaver would have notes, and also she'd have some conditions for this as well. She didn't want her character to use guns. She wanted the character to die, for instance. And these were conditions that Cameron would just basically turn down. Although Weaver, once she got to a producing role on the films, would be able to have some influence over those in later movies in the saga. But instead, what Cameron did was he just found a way to sell the story to her, and she would come to love the script that he put together, but still didn't have a deal with Fox to make the movie. So Cameron, though, was doing his deal with Fox. Condition on that deal was that Gail Ann Hurd was going to be the producer on the movie. She produced The Terminator with him as well. The pair were married at the time too. And he eventually submitted his script in January 1985, the completed version of it. He was been intensely working on it as soon as The Terminator was done and dusted, although The Terminator hadn't made it to the UK yet. A mildly important fact, which we'll come to shortly. When Fox first saw the script, it's just like, well, no, it's just going to be too expensive, way too expensive. The studio was very much in flux at this stage. Horror movies were out, and it was costing the movie. I mean, Fox was estimating it was going to cost in the $30 million range. Gail Ann Hurd was insistent, no, it's not. But it was still clearly going to be a fair amount of change to bring this to the screen. However, it was still moving forward. And I mean, we get to April 1985 and it was crunch time for the negotiations for Sigourney Weaver, because she hadn't signed on the dotted line. And if this film is going to happen, she needs to. Now, Weaver's price had clearly gone up in the aftermath of the success of Alien as well. She'd had other hits. She'd appeared in The Year of Living Dangerously. She'd appeared in Ghostbusters. And her pay packet was going to be significantly increased for this particular movie, and she was going to drive, absolutely rightly so as well, a hard bargain on it. Appreciating Ripley was a supporting role in 79's Alien, the story goes she was only paid about $30,000 for that particular piece of work, and you look at what happened financially to the film in the aftermath of that. But this time, a bit more hardball. But the problem was the contract wasn't coming together, and so Cameron just decided to go a little bit left field, and he called up Arnold Schwarzenegger's agent and dropped in the idea that, well, Sigourney Weaver's not signing on the dotted line, so we're going to drop the character altogether. Would Schwarzenegger be interested in coming in and taking the lead in the Aliens film, and we'll just rewrite it around him? Now, of course, that was never intended, but what Cameron well knew was that Schwarzenegger and Weaver were represented by the same agency at the time, ICM, and wouldn't you know it, a deal was done in 24 hours for Sigourney Weaver to take the lead in Aliens for a price of $1 million. Now, the film was going to shoot in the UK, and so, boy, was that going to be a problem, but design work was quickly underway. Now, this was something that Cameron absolutely loved, of course. I mean, you look at some of the groundbreaking work he did in films like Escape from New York, of course, in The Terminator as well. And one of the centerpiece sequences that he'd envisaged for Aliens involved an alien queen. This, as you'd expect, was going to be a challenge because already they'd only needed one alien in the original film. They were going to need lots of aliens in Aliens, but also the idea of a queen as a much bigger creature, I'm going to spoiler light as possible, well, that was going to take a lot of expertise, not least because they were hardly flush with cash. And so Cameron called in practical effects legend Stan Winston to get to work on a creature that originally was envisaged to use a couple of puppeteers to bring to life. Winston also redid the costumes for the aliens as well. They brought in, they brought in slightly shorter performers than they'd had in the first film. The costumes this time were spandex. They were a lot more flexible. They were still keeping the visual look of the first film, designed, of course, by H.R. Giger. But Giger wasn't involved in this. And in fact, Cameron never reached out to him to get involved in this, which I think he'll come to regret over time. But he was a little bit intimidated by him. And also Giger was involved in making Poltergeist 2 at that point as well. Cameron did bring in legends such as Sid Mead and Ron Cobb to help with the design and the look of the film too, knowing that this was going to be practical. I mean, as much as he'd done a little bit of effects work in The Terminator, and he designed in analog form something that's presented as a digital effect in Escape from New York, this had to be done in camera. Things had to be built, miniatures had to be built, costumes, set design, it all had to look right. Then there was the small matter of casting. I mean, Cameron had worked with Bill Paxton before, of course, and Paxton had joked to him months before that he hoped that there was going to be a part in the Alien sequel for him, and what do you know, and rightly so, there was. Lance Henriksen likewise came in. He'd worked with Cameron on Piranha 2, and also Cameron knew that his arm was going to be forced slightly by shooting in the UK, and as a result he was compelled to have some British actors in there, in particular Jeanette Goldstein playing Vasquez in this one. James Remar came in to play Corporal Hicks, and for the young girl Newt, it was Gail Ann Hurd who would find Carrie Henn. Now, Newt, obviously a pivotal character in the film. I'm assuming you've seen it. I'm still going to spoil a lot. I adore this film. But she was cast because, I mean, at that stage, she was the only 9-year-old really who turned up for the audition without acting experience, and there was something really genuine to her performance, and thus she landed one of the key roles in the film. Now, before Cameron switched on his cameras and started filming, he sent off the actors playing Marines for a 2-week boot camp, and that was led by Al Matthews, who would go on to play Apone in the movie. But the one person he kept separate from that was Sigourney Weaver, that as much as in the film she eventually becomes part of that group, there needed to be a little bit of distance between her and the other characters for the first half of the film really to work. And so whilst they were off doing their 2 weeks of work with doing Marine training, Weaver was kept separate and would rehearse with Cameron instead, and all was looking rosy for a start of production in September of 1985. Where on earth do you start here? Because this was an intense shoot. I mean, Cameron would tell Robert Emery in his book that he was this film had to be taken seriously. He wasn't doing tongue-in-cheek sci-fi. And he liked the idea from the original Alien film that Ridley Scott had made of putting the audience through the longest 2 hours of their lives, that not to bore them, but to make it really, really tense and to make it a real experience for them. But what he wanted to do here was capture that, but also turbocharge things with action. This was going to be a very action-driven film at times. The sets as well that were being built were incredible. Peter Lamont was building them, and one of his key finds for the movie that you'll see when it comes to the alien nest in the film was he found a coal engineering plant in Acton that was no longer in use. And I mean, in pre-production, it took quite a lot of cleaning up, that there was asbestos found in it and such like. And so it took a lot of work and expense to get it ready for filming. But Cameron was really taken with it. He liked the walkways. He liked the rusty equipment in it. In fact, a lot of the design of the film was about well-worn sci-fi. If you go to the Light and Magic documentary on Disney Plus, for instance, and the industrial light and magic geniuses there talk about how the world of Star Wars needed to look used and worn when they were designing that. That was very much the case with Aliens as well, and the plant in Acton was absolutely fitting that ethos. That didn't mean that there weren't pressures to get everything that they wanted. At one stage, Fox was concerned with the budget, and Fox, when it saw footage from the movie coming in, was relatively content, but it suggested cutting the hypersleep sequence from the film as the costs started to escalate. Of course, no one really wanted to tell James Cameron this. Cameron, even by this stage, and he's addressed this a little bit in interviews, a man who perhaps has a less happy side to him at this stage in his career, a very forceful personality who knew what he wanted, and if one of his key sequences was going to be lopped from the script, well, the bottom line here was, you can tell him, I'm not going to. But in fact, they didn't have to really in the end, because instead Peter Lamont came up with a simple but ingenious idea of building fewer hypersleep chambers, but then just using simple mirrors to make it look like more of them. There you go, a simple result. It was a few days into filming that the problems really started to kick off, not least because James Remar was replaced in one of the lead roles of Corporal Hicks. That at the time the story being put around was there was an artistic difference between Remar and James Cameron, and it wouldn't be until some time further down the line that Remar would admit that he was found in possession of drugs and thus got the boot from Aliens, and it meant a replacement needed to be scrambled very, very quickly. And what do you know, there was someone who Cameron had worked with before, Michael Biehn, and he came in after a few days of filming to take on the role of Hicks. By this stage, some footage of Remar had already been shot and they didn't reshoot it, so apparently there's one or two little bits of him in the movie, but I think most of us, when we think of Corporal Hicks, it is Michael Biehn. Before we get into how things really started to get troublesome, we should note that the Alien Queen that I talked about before, in the end it would need 14 to 16 operators to get the thing moving and working on screen. Cameron also, as much as he'd written the script, he did allow room for improvisation as well. I mean, Bill Paxton's memorable Game Over Man, that was improvised, and he put a little bit of wiggle room in there. However, time was ticking, and the shoot at Pinewood Studios, well, let's just say it wasn't really a culture that Cameron was used to. So Pinewood here in the UK was at a point in filmmaking where if you booked a studio, you tended to take the crew that was part and parcel of that studio. You didn't bring your own crew in, that you had the people who'd been working at Pinewood, in some cases for decades, and you were just their next job. For Cameron, on The Terminator, he'd been able to pick who he wanted to work them as hard as he wanted. But union rules in the UK were different, and it was mandated that there was a working day on this, and the crew would expect a lunch break as well. And Cameron tells a story too about when he was setting up one particularly complex shot, and the door swung open, and someone wheeled in the tea trolley, and I don't believe he was in a good mood when that happened. I mean, Rebecca Keegan's book again goes into this in a lot of detail. And he found himself working on his first big Hollywood production with a sequel to a major movie, and a big deal movie, with a crew for whom a 12-hour day was a push, and he was used to working 14, 15, 16-hour days in some cases. Now, it didn't help that James Cameron was a nobody to this crew as well, because the Terminator hadn't made it to the UK. This wasn't a case of in had come this huge director, and so we'd better do what he says. He knows what he's doing. He was an unknown to most of the crew that he was working with, and whilst he would offer to screen the Terminator for the crew of the film, he would report that barely anyone would turn up to watch it. And so as far as some of the crew were concerned, he was a bit of a bossy nobody and a man with, how do I put it? Let's just say a bit of a temper. Heard would report her being told, and she was the producer of the film, being told by some people that they just wouldn't take orders from a woman. Happy 1980s, everybody. And then Cameron would end up clashing with a couple of really established filmmaking experts as well. In particular, let's have a look at the example of Derek Cracknell, a man who'd been was first assistant director on the film, had worked with Stanley Kubrick. And Cameron would ask for a shot to be set up a certain way, and Cracknell would disagree with him, and the shot would not necessarily be set up the way that Cameron wanted. And I don't think James Cameron liked that very much. It was going slowly as a result of this, and so the shoot was soon falling behind. Dick Bush was the original director of photography, and he wasn't going in the way and at the pace that Cameron wanted either. He would soon be replaced by Adrian Biddle. Cracknell was soon out of the door as well, and the crew was unhappy to the point that at one stage it just simply down tools and refused to keep working on the film. All while all these practical these practical sets were all around, and all these creature effects were being put together, and with a really tight deadline to get the movie done, that was it. They didn't want to work with him. And this wasn't an era where the British filmmaking industry was burgeoning. There were not a lot of alternative crews that they could bring in to pick up the slack. And so Cameron got on the phone and just asked if he could move the whole production to America. He asked Fox for permission for that. Absolutely no dice. Not going to happen. Not got the time, not got the money to do it. You're going to have to make it work. And so instead what happened is they just called together a huge clearing the air meeting where Cameron stood in front of them, at 31, and explained this is a huge movie for him. He knows what he wants to do. It's a big studio film. He needs their help to get it done. And the crew, in return, they aired their grievances over the way that they believed Cameron was treating them. And it wasn't the friendliest of environments from what I can understand. But between them all, they reached some degree of accord and were able to get back to work, and Aliens could keep shooting. So it got to the point where at the end of December 1985, production could finally wrap up on the film, and Cameron would drive away from Pinewood and would vow never to go back. In fact, that's one of the famous quotes of his time working there, that he reconciled with the crew that at the end of all of this, he could drive away from Pinewood. The rest of them were stuck there. That's what happened. He did drive away, and I don't get any sense at all that Christmas cards were exchanged. Happy to be proven wrong. Even in post-production, this was going to be complex and this was going to be troublesome, because Fox by this stage was looking to put the film out in the summer of 1986, and it had had a rancid 1985. The films just weren't hitting. Things weren't working. Murdoch was in. They were looking for results, and there was a feeling that the film side of 20th Century Fox was just in terminal decline. Against this backdrop, Ray Lovejoy came in to edit the movie based on he was hired by Cameron based on the back of his work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, again with Kubrick, again a film that Cameron absolutely adored. But Lovejoy was going at a pace and in a manner that Cameron didn't want. Cameron wanted real energy and speed to this film. I don't think that's anything you particularly relate to 2001, in fairness. And Lovejoy was going about it in the way that he knew. And again, there was a clash on this one, to the point where Cameron had lined up a replacement. A man called Mark Goldblatt was going to come in and take over as the editor of the film. But this is where it's a lovely bit of the story that Ray Lovejoy apparently got wind of this and would lock himself away and take the battle sequence at the end of the movie, lock himself away for a weekend when he knew that his job was under some degree of threat. And a week later, he gave Cameron the edited version of that sequence, and Cameron was just like, oh, okay, that works. And so Ray Lovejoy would stay on board to edit the movie and to see it through to fruition. James Horner, meanwhile, came in as composer. This was the first time that he would work with Cameron. Brad Fiedel had done Terminator with him. But this was going to be a baptism of fire, really, for Horner, that the film's schedule was running very, very close to the line. And whilst Horner was supposed to have 7 weeks to come up with his score and record his score, in the end he had about 2. And in fact, he was writing score just a week before the film was heading out to distribution, in some part not having seen the final sequences that he was penning the score for. Because there was another problem with the edit of this one as well, in that the film was running really long. The first cut that Cameron was happy with was 2 hours 45, and he was really happy with it as well. He was really struggling to cut this down, and he didn't see where he could, but also he's a realist. He knew he couldn't present this to 20th Century Fox and expect the studio to distribute it as it was. And it was Gail Ann Hurd who suggested cutting basically a whole reel out of the movie. The whole setup section before we get to the aliens attack that sets the scene for the colony and puts more background in for the character of Ellen Ripley as well. And Sigourney Weaver wasn't reportedly best pleased when this stuff was excised, but Gail Ann Hurd just suggested take that whole lot out. Don't go in there looking to find like 5 seconds here, 10 seconds out there. Just take that whole lot out. And he slept on it and realised, yeah, she's right. And so nearly half an hour came out of the film pretty much in one go, bringing the final running time of the theatrical version of Aliens down to 2 hours 17 minutes. Still on the long side, but you could get that through the studio. Fox was wary though. As much as it had liked the footage of the film, there was still some umming and ahhing over whether this was going to work. And there wasn't time for test screening or anything like that. The only screening they could do was when Cameron presented a print of the movie for Fox executives. And in there was a man called Tom Sherrick, who was responsible for the marketing of the film. And he sat down to watch it. And he knew by the halfway point of that screening that, heck, did they have something here? And so Aliens would head into cinemas on July the 18th. 1986. He got it there on time, and the reception to the movie was, it was strong. And sci-fi films don't tend to be reviewed very well, but this was a feeling that it was a sequel that actually did something. It didn't just repeat the first film, it enriched the world of the first film, it built on it, it did something different. And of course, historically, as we look back now, Aliens is the template of what you do with a sequel. That you take you take what was special about the first film, but you do something different with it. And in fact, the critical acclaim for this would lead all the way to the Oscars as well. To the surprise of many, at the point the Academy Awards were announced in 1987, Sigourney Weaver, and it's only a surprise because it's a sci-fi sequel and this doesn't happen, got a Best Actress Oscar nomination for the film, and nobody would have seen that coming right at the start. In fact, you name any action film recently where the lead of an action film has got an Oscar nomination. James Horner's score got an Oscar nomination. The art direction got a nomination. The editing did. The sound did. And whilst it didn't bring all of those home, it did pick up 2 Oscars for its visual effects and for its sound effects editing. But to the absolute delight of Fox, the bigger thing was it finally had a big box office hit. When it landed in cinemas on the 18th to the 20th of July 1986 in the US, Aliens opened with $10 million. It had cost $18 million to make the film. Still quite frugal when you consider what's put on screen. But this was a result and a half, at a point where $10 million was a lot of money. And the thing for Fox as well is Aliens was getting great word of mouth. It opened up again. The films it was against at the point, it opened up against those well-known new releases, Vamp and Pirates. In fact, the competition was more coming from holdovers like The Karate Kid Part 2 and Ruthless People and Top Gun. But a week later, Heartburn opened against it. Nope. Aliens still number one. Week after that, well, here came even more competition. Flight of the Navigator, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, Howard the Duck, they all opened. Nope, Aliens still number one, 3 weeks in. 4 weeks in, along comes One Crazy Summer, A Fine Mess, Aliens still topping the chart, and after 5 weeks it was finally knocked off the top by, wouldn't you know it, another genre film from 20th Century Fox, 1986's take on The Fly. By the time Aliens left cinemas, it had done $85 million in the US, and it would add another chunk overseas as well. But for Fox as well, it would continue and has continued to be a huge money spinner. Two aftermaths of this one. First of all, Cameron would in 1992 go back and do a special edition, not a director's cut, he called it a special edition of Aliens, where he put in the sequences that were lopped out just ahead of the theatrical release of the film. There's some debate over whether they add or take away from the film. I really like them. And then, of course, the saga would keep on going, and Fox would have numerous struggles with future Alien chapters, not least Alien 3 that was coming round the corner, but not for another 6 years. Wouldn't you know it, though? That's a story for another episode of Film Stories. But now that brings me to the end of this one. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. You can find more on what James Cameron did straight after Aliens by digging out the podcast that I've done on The Abyss. That's out there as well. If you want our magazines or our sneakers Blu-ray, more on that is at store.filmstories.co.uk. At our website, filmstories.co.uk, that's updated every weekday with movie news, movie features, all sorts of bobbins like that. And then we're at, youtube.com/filmstoriesonline as well. And the Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. But I've horribly overrun. This is the longest non-special episode, so I'm going to shut up. I'm going to leave you in peace. I'm going to thank you for your time. Main thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.